I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you have cared for a child not your own, stood quietly in the background while your kindness went unnoticed, or longed to be recognized for the love you gave in silence. It doesn't matter what time it is or where you are, but today's story will move you in ways you didn't expect. It's about a woman whose name was once whispered only in shadows, a nanny whose life was broken by betrayal, yet who held the heart of a family stronger than blood. This is the story behind the moment when a young millionaire humiliated the nanny. But when she whispered his full name, his whole world fell apart. In the heart of Pacific Heights, where San Francisco's elite carved their legacy into stone and steel, the Langley mansion stood like a monument to wealth. Its tall windows caught the morning fog rolling in from the bay, while inside, the polished marble floors reflected chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes. The scent of expensive orchids filled the foyer, and the silence was broken only by the distant hum of the stock market ticker in Richard Langley Sr.'s study. A man whose net worth exceeded $200 million, built from decades of shrewd real estate investments and tech company acquisitions that had made him one of the city's most formidable businessmen. But in the sprawling kitchen on the ground floor, where sunlight streamed through bay windows overlooking the meticulously manicured gardens, a different kind of wealth was being counted. Grace Miller stood at the granite countertop, her weathered hands carefully preparing breakfast for 3 children who would never know hunger, never know want, but who desperately needed something money couldn't buy. At 52, Grace had spent 13 years in this house, her graying hair always pulled back in a simple bun, her clothes clean but unremarkable. A woman who had learned to make herself invisible while holding an entire family together with quiet strength. The sound of small feet on the back staircase announced the arrival of 8-year-old Sophie, the youngest Langley child, her golden curls still messy from sleep. Behind her came 12-year-old Emma, already showing signs of the Langley pride in her straight shoulders and lifted chin. And finally, 16-year-old David, tall, sharp-featured like his father, but with eyes that still held traces of the confused boy who had once run to Grace after nightmares. The children moved through their morning routine with the ease of those who had never questioned their place in the world, while Grace orchestrated their needs with the precision of a conductor guiding a symphony. "Good morning, my darlings," Grace whispered, her voice carrying the soft accent of her Dublin childhood, though decades in America had smoothed most of its edges. She had learned long ago to speak quietly in this house, to take up as little space as possible while somehow managing to fill the emotional void that money had created. The smell of fresh pancakes mixed with the aroma of coffee brewing, and for a moment, the kitchen felt like the heart of a real home rather than the service area of a business empire. David barely looked up from his phone, already absorbed in scrolling through investment apps and cryptocurrency markets, a habit his father encouraged as preparation for inheriting the family fortune. At 16, he spoke fluently of Bitcoin valuations and stock portfolios, but struggled to make eye contact with the woman who had taught him to tie his shoes. Emma grabbed her backpack with practiced efficiency, her mind already focused on the private school where she excelled in languages and mathematics, while Sophie lingered near Grace, still young enough to crave the warmth that money couldn't provide. Grace had arrived at the Langley estate on a gray February morning in 2010, carrying a single suitcase and a heart still raw from loss. The employment agency in the Tenderloin district had called it a golden opportunity, a permanent position with San Francisco's wealthiest families, complete health coverage, and a salary that would lift her from the studio apartment where she had spent 2 years recovering from the worst chapter of her life. What they hadn't mentioned was how the marble walls would echo with loneliness, or how she would pour her shattered maternal instincts into children who were taught never to see her as more than hired help. The early months had been a delicate dance of boundaries and needs. Richard Sr. was a widower who had lost his wife in a car accident when Sophie was barely 2 years old, and the children moved through their days like ships without anchors. cared for by a rotating cast of au pairs and housekeepers who came and went with seasonal regularity. The house ran on schedules and systems, every moment accounted for in calendars and contracts, but there was no one to kiss scraped knees or listen to midnight fears. Grace slipped into that void naturally, her instincts sharpened by her own profound loss, the death of her 5-year-old daughter Lily from leukemia, a tragedy that had left her marriage in ruins and her heart convinced it would never heal. Those first years were painted in small moments that no one else noticed. The way Sophie would seek out Grace's lap during thunderstorms, finding comfort in arms that had once held another little girl through similar fears. The afternoon David came home from school with a black eye and bloodied knuckles. Too proud to admit he'd been defending a smaller child from bullies, but allowing Grace to clean his wounds while he whispered the truth he couldn't tell his father. The evening Emma won her first academic award, but had no one to call because her father was in Hong Kong negotiating a multi-million-dollar merger. So she sat in Grace's small room instead, showing off the certificate, while Grace braided her hair and told stories of strong women who changed the world. But the house had rules, unspoken but absolute. Grace learned them through sideways glances and corrected behaviors, through conversations that stopped when she entered rooms and invitations that were never extended. Staff quarters are on the 3rd floor, the head housekeeper Mrs. Chen had explained during Grace's first week, her tone making clear that boundaries existed for reasons that went beyond convenience. The family has their space, and we have ours. During dinner parties, Grace would serve and clean while staying invisible, watching the children navigate adult conversations about art collections and foundation galas, learning to perform the roles their wealth demanded while their eyes searched the room for the one person who truly knew them. The loneliness was a constant companion, sharp as winter fog rolling off the bay. Grace would lie awake in her small room on the 3rd floor, listening to the house settle around her, knowing that 3 floors below, Sophie might be having bad dreams while David struggled with algebra homework that no one would check. She had learned to love fiercely while accepting that her love could never be acknowledged, to be a mother without the recognition that motherhood deserved. Her sacrifice became as natural as breathing, invisible, essential, and utterly taken for granted. Richard Sr. was not a cruel man, merely absent in the way that great wealth often demands. His days were consumed with board meetings and investment strategies, his evenings with business dinners and charitable obligations. He provided his children with the finest educations and most exclusive opportunities, but he had never learned the language of emotional intimacy. When he looked at Grace, he saw efficiency and reliability, qualities he valued in all his employees, but never the woman who had become the emotional anchor of his fractured family. The children grew around Grace like plants reaching toward the sun, drawing strength and comfort from her steady presence while barely acknowledging the source of their stability. They brought her their triumphs and failures, their secrets and fears, treating her small room as a sanctuary where vulnerability was safe. But outside those private moments, in the marble hallways and formal dining rooms, they learned to see her as the adults did, necessary but invisible, caring but ultimately replaceable. Grace accepted this contradiction with the patience of someone who had learned that love doesn't always demand recognition. She had discovered that healing her own broken heart required pouring that love into vessels that might never pour back, and she had made peace with the mathematics of that exchange. Her former life, the marriage that had crumbled under grief, the career in pediatric nursing that had become too painful to continue, felt like stories from someone else's existence. This house, these children, this careful dance of devotion and distance had become her world. The first crack in David's carefully constructed indifference came on a November evening when he was 14, stumbling home from a friend's house with alcohol on his breath and shame written across his features. He had been experimenting with rebellion, testing the boundaries of his privileged existence, when a party had gone wrong and left him stranded in an unfamiliar part of the city with no money and no one to call. His father was in New York, Emma was at debate camp, and Sophie was too young to help. He had walked for miles, his confidence dissolving with each step, until he reached the familiar gates of home. Grace found him sitting on the kitchen steps at midnight, his expensive clothes wrinkled and his young face streaked with tears he was trying desperately to hide. She didn't lecture or judge, didn't threaten to tell his father or demand explanations. Instead, she sat beside him in the darkness and asked if he was hurt, then guided him inside and made hot chocolate while he showered and changed. They sat at the kitchen island in comfortable silence, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, while Grace waited for him to speak. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be," he finally whispered, the words torn from some deep place he had never shared with anyone. "Everyone expects me to be like him, to want what he wants, but I don't even know what I want for myself." Grace nodded, her hands wrapped around her own mug. Understanding that this moment was fragile and precious, the first time this young man had allowed her to see past the armor his wealth required him to wear. "You're allowed to be uncertain," she said softly, her voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. "That's what being young means, having time to discover who you really are underneath what everyone else expects." She told him about her own youth in Dublin, about dreams deferred and paths taken for all the wrong reasons, about the way clarity sometimes comes only through making mistakes and finding the courage to change direction. That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship, though David would spend years fighting against it. He began seeking her out for conversations he couldn't have with anyone else, drawn to the way Grace listened without judgment and offered perspective without pressure. She became his confessor and counselor, the safe harbor where his confusion and vulnerability were not weaknesses to be hidden, but natural parts of growing up. But even as their bond deepened, the invisible rules of the house remained unchanged, and David learned to compartmentalize his affection, treating Grace with casual indifference in public while treasuring their private moments. The other children, too, had discovered that Grace was the emotional center of their universe. Emma brought her academic pressures and social anxieties, finding in Grace a woman who celebrated her intelligence while reminding her that worth couldn't be measured in achievements alone. Sophie, entering her own complicated adolescence, turned to Grace for guidance through the mystery of becoming a woman in a world that expected her to be ornamental but not substantial. Grace became their translator of emotions, their guide through the complexities of growing up wealthy but emotionally impoverished. But love given without acknowledgement extracts its own toll. Grace felt herself growing smaller with each passing year, her identity shrinking to fit the narrow space the family had carved out for her devotion. She saved her money carefully, knowing that security was temporary in a world where loyalty was expected but never guaranteed. Her small room filled with photographs of the children at different stages of growth, but none included her. She was always the one taking the pictures, never the one being remembered. The ache of invisibility became a constant companion, sharp as fog and just as inescapable. When David turned 18 and prepared to leave for Stanford University, Grace allowed herself to imagine that he might acknowledge what she had meant to him, might offer some gesture of gratitude before beginning his new life. Instead, he treated his departure as liberation from childhood constraints, eager to shed all reminders of dependence and vulnerability. His goodbye was perfunctory, distracted, his attention already focused on the future he was racing toward. Grace watched his graduation party from the kitchen window, seeing him surrounded by friends and family who celebrated his achievements, while she cleaned up the remnants of a celebration she had organized but wasn't invited to join. The wound of that dismissal lodged itself deep in Grace's heart. But she swallowed her disappointment and continued caring for Emma and Sophie with the same devotion she had always shown. She told herself that love was not transactional, that the joy of nurturing didn't depend on being thanked. But late at night, in the silence of her small room, she wondered if she had spent 13 years pouring her heart into an emptiness that could never be filled, loving children who were taught to see affection as something they deserved rather than something they should cherish. The house felt different with David away at college, the dynamic shifting as Emma stepped into the role of eldest child and Sophie began the difficult transition from childhood to adolescence. Richard Sr. remained absorbed in his business empire, his wealth continuing to grow as real estate markets soared and his investment portfolio expanded to include cryptocurrency and international ventures. The family's net worth crossed the $300 million threshold, but emotional poverty remained their defining characteristic. Grace continued her quiet work, loving without expectation, nurturing without recognition, holding the family together with invisible threads that no one else could see. Grace's true confession came on a rain-soaked evening in March when Mrs. Chen was visiting her sister in Los Angeles and the house felt emptier than usual. Emma was studying abroad in Paris, Sophie was at a sleepover with school friends, and Richard Sr. was in Tokyo negotiating the acquisition of a technology startup. Grace found herself alone with her memories and the weight of years spent loving in silence. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember Lily, her own daughter, the child who had died too young and left her heart so broken that she had thought it could never heal. The memories came in waves, washing over her with unexpected force. Lily's laugh, bright as summer morning, the way she had curled against Grace's side during bedtime stories, her small fingers tracing pictures in favorite books, the hospital vigil that had stretched for months, watching her daughter fight a battle that medical science couldn't win, the funeral that had marked the end of Grace's marriage and her former life, leaving her adrift in grief so profound it had seemed impossible to survive. Grace had never spoken of Lily to the Langley children, afraid that her own loss might somehow contaminate their innocence. But sitting alone in the kitchen where she had spent 13 years nurturing other people's children, she realized that her silence had been a form of self-protection that had also been self-punishment. She had poured her maternal love into David, Emma, and Sophie, not just because they needed her, but because being needed was the only way she knew how to honor the daughter she had lost. The revelation was both liberating and heartbreaking. Grace understood with crystalline clarity that she had been trying to mother her way back to wholeness, using the Langley children as vessels for love that had nowhere else to go. They had accepted her devotion as naturally as they accepted the trust funds that would someday make them independently wealthy, never understanding that her love was not an employee benefit, but the overflow of a heart that had learned to heal by giving. She had been their emotional inheritance, the gift that prepared them to love and be loved. But like all the best gifts, her value would only be recognized after it was gone. That night, Grace wrote a letter she never intended to send, a document of honesty addressed to no one in particular, but containing everything she wished the children understood about love and sacrifice and the invisible work of holding a family together. She wrote about Lily, about the particular grief of losing a child and the unexpected grace of finding healing through caring for other children. She wrote about the loneliness of loving without acknowledgement, the strength required to remain devoted when devotion was taken for granted. She wrote about watching them grow and change while she remained fixed in the background, necessary but unnoticed, essential but easily overlooked. The letter filled 12 pages with careful cursive, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had spent years keeping her truth locked inside. Grace sealed it in an envelope and tucked it away in her dresser drawer, beneath the photographs of children who had become her world, but had never been taught to see her as part of theirs. She considered it a form of therapy, a way to honor her feelings without burdening anyone else with her pain. She had no intention of sharing it, no desire to make anyone feel guilty for patterns they hadn't chosen. It was enough to have spoken her truth, even if only to herself. Spring dissolved into summer, and David returned from his freshman year at Stanford full of new ideas and expanded horizons. College had broadened his perspective in some ways, while reinforcing his sense of entitlement in others. He spoke casually of classmates from different backgrounds, seemed more aware of social inequalities, but still moved through his family's mansion with the unconscious assumption that privilege was natural and service was invisible. He was polite to Grace, even occasionally warm, but their relationship had shifted to something more distant and formal, the inevitable result of his growing independence and her persistent marginalization. The summer passed in familiar rhythms of family activity and household management. Richard Sr. hosted several dinner parties for business associates, events where Grace worked behind the scenes to ensure seamless hospitality while remaining carefully out of sight. Emma returned from Paris with sophisticated new perspectives and fluency in languages that would serve her well in the international business world she planned to enter. Sophie, now 13, was struggling with adolescent identity questions and the particular pressures that came with growing up beautiful and wealthy in a city that worshipped both qualities. Grace continued her quiet stewardship of the family's emotional needs, but she felt herself becoming increasingly peripheral to their lives. The children were growing into their own relationships and interests, naturally pulling away from childhood dependencies while never quite acknowledging what those dependencies had meant. She was proud of their growth and independence, genuinely happy to see them becoming confident, capable young people. But her pride was tinged with the melancholy recognition that successful parenting inevitably leads to being needed less. The catalyst for change came with the hiring of Amanda Richardson, a 28-year-old family coordinator with an MBA from Wharton and ideas about modernizing the Langley household management. Richard Sr. had met her at a charity gala where she was representing a firm that specialized in luxury lifestyle management for high-net-worth families. He was impressed by her credentials and her proposals for streamlining household operations through technology and updated systems. Amanda brought fresh energy and contemporary perspectives to a house that had been running on tradition and institutional memory. Amanda was everything Grace was not: young, educated, connected to social media networks and modern trends that seemed to fascinate the children. She spoke the language of efficiency and optimization, proposing changes that would reduce costs and increase convenience. She had spreadsheets for household budgets and apps for scheduling family activities. She understood the latest social media platforms and could help manage the family's public image in ways that hadn't existed when Grace began working for them. At first, Grace welcomed the additional help and tried to work collaboratively with Amanda, sharing the institutional knowledge she had accumulated over 13 years. But Amanda's vision for the household didn't include much room for traditional approaches or sentimental attachments. She saw Grace as a relic of an older system, well-meaning but outdated, emotionally invested in ways that compromised professional objectivity. Their philosophical differences became increasingly apparent as Amanda implemented changes that prioritized efficiency over the personal relationships Grace had cultivated with the children. The tension peaked during a staff meeting in October when Amanda presented Richard Sr. with a comprehensive restructuring plan designed to modernize household operations and reduce long-term staffing costs. Her proposal included outsourcing several functions to service companies, updating technology systems, and eliminating positions that she deemed redundant or inefficient. Grace's role, as Amanda diplomatically phrased it, had evolved beyond current family needs and could be transitioned to a more appropriate arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. Richard Sr. listened to the presentation with the same analytical attention he brought to business decisions. Amanda's arguments were compelling from a purely financial perspective, and her credentials suggested she understood contemporary approaches to household management. Grace had been with the family for 13 years, longer than any other employee, and her salary and benefits represented a significant annual expense. The children were older now, less dependent on daily childcare, more capable of managing their own schedules and needs. From a business standpoint, the decision seemed logical, but Amanda had made one critical miscalculation. She had failed to understand that Grace's value to the family extended far beyond the job description she had been hired to fulfill. Amanda saw only the surface functions, cooking, cleaning, scheduling, and missed the emotional infrastructure Grace had built and maintained for more than a decade. She didn't know about midnight conversations with David about his fears and dreams, or Emma's struggles with perfectionism, or Sophie's need for someone who listened without judgment. Amanda saw inefficiency where there was actually irreplaceable relationship, redundancy where there was essential emotional support. The family meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in November when all the children would be present to hear about the proposed changes. Richard Sr. approached it as he would any business decision, presenting Amanda's plan as a logical evolution that would benefit everyone. David, now 19 and preparing for his sophomore year, listened with the detached interest of someone who no longer spent much time at home anyway. Emma, at 17, was absorbed in college preparation and social activities that kept her busy outside the house. Sophie, at 13, was the only one who seemed troubled by the conversation, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite understand. Grace learned about the decision secondhand from Mrs. Chen, who had been informed that her own hours would be reduced as part of the overall restructuring. The news arrived like a physical blow, unexpected and devastating, despite years of understanding that her security was temporary. She had known, intellectually, that her position could end at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. But she had believed, perhaps naively, that 13 years of devotion had earned her something more than a business decision. She had thought, without quite admitting it to herself, that love would somehow matter more than efficiency. The formal conversation with Richard Sr. took place in his study on a foggy Thursday morning, surrounded by the evidence of his financial success, awards from business organizations, photographs with politicians and celebrities, art that cost more than most people's houses. He explained the decision with the same courteous professionalism he brought to all personnel matters, emphasizing that the change was not a reflection of her performance, but rather an evolution of family needs. He offered her a generous severance package and excellent references, acknowledging her years of loyal service while making clear that the decision was final. Grace listened with the composure she had cultivated over decades of absorbing disappointment and rejection, her face revealing none of the devastation she felt inside. She thanked him for the opportunity, accepted the severance terms, and asked for 2 weeks to make arrangements for her departure. Richard Sr. seemed relieved by her gracious acceptance, perhaps having feared a more emotional response. He had no way of knowing that Grace's composure was not acceptance, but shock, the numbness that precedes deeper pain. The 2 weeks that followed were among the most difficult of Grace's life. She continued her daily routines while privately preparing to leave the only home she had known for 13 years. She sorted through her belongings, keeping photographs and letters the children had written her over the years, leaving behind everything else as too painful to carry. She wrote individual letters to each child, trying to capture in words the love and hopes she carried for them, then decided the letters were too sentimental and put them away unsent. David was away at Stanford and learned about Grace's departure through a casual phone call from Emma. His reaction was surprisingly muted, a brief expression of regret followed by questions about who would be handling his laundry when he came home for Christmas. He had already begun the emotional separation that wealth teaches, the ability to move through life without forming attachments that might become inconvenient or complicate business decisions. Grace's departure was unfortunate but not particularly significant, another change in a life that would be full of changes. Emma's response was more complicated, a mixture of genuine sadness and relief that surprised her with its intensity. She'd been preparing to leave for college herself and felt guilty about the timing, as if her own growing independence had somehow contributed to Grace's dismissal. But she was also old enough to recognize the social dynamics at play, to understand that Grace's emotional intimacy with the family was exactly what made her expendable. Emma had been taught that success required a certain ruthlessness, and she was beginning to learn what that looked like in practice. Sophie's reaction was the most painful for Grace to witness. At 13, she was old enough to understand that something important was ending, but too young to process the complex emotions the departure triggered. She clung to Grace with desperate intensity, making promises about staying in touch and visiting that both of them knew would be difficult to keep. Sophie's grief was pure and uncomplicated, the reaction of someone who had never learned to protect herself from loving too deeply or expecting too much from the people who mattered to her. Grace's final morning at the Langley house was deliberately quiet and undramatic. She had asked Mrs. Chen to call her a taxi and planned to leave while the children were at school, avoiding painful goodbyes that would serve no purpose. She packed her single suitcase with the same efficiency she had brought to everything else, leaving no trace of her 13 years in the small room that had been her sanctuary. The photographs, letters, and small mementos that represented her relationships with the children fit easily into one box that she carried under her arm. But Sophie had orchestrated her own goodbye, hiding in Grace's room since dawn and refusing to go to school until they could have a proper farewell. She presented Grace with a handmade scrapbook filled with memories they had shared. Photographs from birthday parties and holiday celebrations, ticket stubs from movies and museums, pressed flowers from garden walks they had taken together. Each page represented moments that Sophie had treasured while they were happening, evidence of a relationship that had mattered deeply to at least one member of the family. Grace hugged Sophie with fierce tenderness, memorizing the weight of this child in her arms, the smell of her shampoo, the sound of her voice promising to remember everything Grace had taught her. But even as they clung to each other, Grace knew that Sophie would grow and change, that new influences would reshape her memories and priorities. The love they had shared was real and valuable, but it lived in a world where love was not considered sufficient reason to stay. The taxi ride through San Francisco streets felt like a journey through her own history, past landmarks that held memories of errands run for the family, parks where she had taken the children, shops where she had bought birthday presents with her own money because she wanted them to have something special. The city looked the same, but Grace felt fundamentally changed. No longer the woman who had devoted 13 years to nurturing someone else's children, but not yet sure who she was supposed to become instead. Grace found a studio apartment in the Richmond district, a neighborhood that buzzed with the energy of families and immigrants building new lives from modest beginnings. After the marble silence of the Langley mansion, the constant sounds of children playing, adults talking, music drifting from open windows felt like a return to life. Her new apartment was tiny compared to her former accommodations, but it belonged to her completely, the first space she had controlled since becoming a widow more than 15 years earlier. She furnished it slowly and carefully, choosing pieces that reflected her own taste rather than institutional requirements or someone else's aesthetic preferences. Employment came through a community center in the Sunset District, where her experience with children and her natural warmth made her valuable despite her lack of formal credentials in social work. She helped coordinate after-school programs for families who struggled to afford quality childcare, drawing on skills she had developed while managing the Langley household, but applying them to serve people who genuinely needed and appreciated her efforts. The work paid a fraction of her former salary, but provided something the mansion had never offered: recognition, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing that her contributions mattered to people who couldn't take them for granted. Months passed in this new rhythm of independence and purposeful work. Grace discovered aspects of herself that had been dormant during her years of service, interests and opinions that had been submerged under the requirements of accommodating other people's needs. She joined a book club at the local library, volunteered at a community garden, took a pottery class at the recreation center. Slowly, carefully, she began building a life that belonged entirely to her, shaped by her own choices and desires rather than other people's expectations. But the Langley children remained in her heart, occupying space that couldn't be filled by new relationships or activities. She wondered about their progress, worried about their emotional development, carried hope that the love she had given them would somehow influence their capacity to love others. She had no contact information for them and made no effort to establish communication, understanding that her role in their lives had ended and that reaching out would be inappropriate. But she carried them with her like a secret prayer, her love for them transformed into a blessing she sent silently across the city that contained them all. Meanwhile, in the mansion above Pacific Heights, the family was learning what life looked like without Grace's invisible presence. Amanda's efficiency improvements were working exactly as promised. Schedules ran smoothly, costs were reduced, technology streamlined many household functions. But something indefinable had been lost, a warmth and attention to individual needs that couldn't be replicated through systems and procedures. The children moved through their daily routines with less friction, but also less connection. Their emotional needs met adequately, but not lovingly. David returned from Stanford for Christmas break to find a house that looked the same but felt different. Amanda's competence was impressive, but she approached the children as clients rather than individuals, managing their needs rather than nurturing their growth. She knew about their schedules and preferences, but not their fears and dreams. She could coordinate complex logistics, but couldn't provide the emotional safety net that had allowed them to take risks and make mistakes without fear of judgment or abandonment. The absence was most apparent during David's moments of vulnerability, late at night when he couldn't sleep, during telephone conversations with his father that left him feeling inadequate and misunderstood, when he struggled with decisions about his future that seemed simultaneously critical and impossible to make correctly. In the past, he would have wandered down to the kitchen where Grace would be preparing breakfast for the next day, and they would talk through his confusion while she worked. Now the kitchen was empty after dinner, cleaned and closed until morning, and David found himself alone with uncertainties that felt larger and more frightening without someone who knew him well enough to offer perspective. Emma experienced similar disconnection during her winter break, though she was more analytical about identifying what was missing. Her conversations with friends at Stanford and other universities had opened her eyes to different models of family intimacy and emotional support. She began to recognize that her family's wealth had insulated them from some experiences, but it also impoverished them in ways that money couldn't remedy. She found herself missing Grace, not just as an individual, but as a representative of emotional values that their household had lost. Sophie's experience was the most directly painful. At 13, she was navigating social pressures and identity questions that felt overwhelming, but she no longer had access to the steady, unconditional support that had been Grace's greatest gift. Amanda was professional and helpful, but she approached Sophie's problems as issues to be resolved rather than stages of growth to be supported. Sophie felt increasingly isolated in her own home, surrounded by people who cared about her success, but not necessarily about her happiness or emotional well-being. The breaking point came in February, during a family dinner that revealed the emotional fault lines that had developed since Grace's departure. David had returned to Stanford feeling disconnected and uncertain about his major and career path. But when he tried to discuss his concerns with his father, the conversation devolved into familiar patterns of judgment and disappointment. Richard Sr. couldn't understand why his son was questioning choices that seemed obvious and advantageous, while David couldn't explain his need for meaning and purpose beyond financial success. Emma attempted to mediate, drawing on communication skills she was developing through her college coursework, but she found herself missing Grace's ability to translate between family members with different emotional languages. Sophie watched the conflict escalate with growing distress, remembering how Grace used to diffuse tension through small gestures of care and attention that reminded everyone of their underlying love for each other. Without that emotional leadership, the family's wealth became a barrier rather than a bond, highlighting their differences rather than supporting their connection. The fight ended with David storming out and driving back to Palo Alto 2 days earlier than planned, while Emma retreated to her room and Sophie cried herself to sleep. Richard Sr. was left alone in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his financial success, but forced to confront the possibility that his family was falling apart despite having every material advantage. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about Grace, not as an employee who had been efficiently replaced, but as a person who had somehow held his children together when he couldn't figure out how to do it himself. The revelation came gradually, through small observations and growing awareness rather than any single dramatic moment. Richard Sr. began noticing how differently his children behaved during family interactions, how their conversations lacked the warmth and ease that had characterized earlier years. He remembered family meetings that had been more successful, holiday celebrations that had felt more connected, daily routines that had somehow flowed more smoothly, despite having less sophisticated management systems. Amanda's reports on household efficiency were excellent, her cost-saving measures impressive, her coordination of family schedules flawless. But Richard Sr. was beginning to understand that a household was more than the sum of its operational functions, that the emotional climate of a family couldn't be optimized through spreadsheets and technology. He started paying closer attention to his children's behavior and realized that something crucial had been lost when they restructured their domestic arrangements. The understanding deepened through conversations with other parents in his social and business circles, many of whom spoke warmly about caregivers who had played important roles in their families. He heard stories of nannies who had become beloved family members, housekeepers who had been honored at children's weddings, domestic staff who had maintained relationships with multiple generations of the families they served. These conversations helped him recognize that Grace's long tenure and close relationships with his children had been assets rather than complications, signs of success rather than problems to be solved. David's phone call from Stanford in March provided the catalyst for action. His son sounded lost and depressed, struggling with coursework and social relationships in ways that seemed disproportionate to the normal challenges of college life. When David mentioned feeling disconnected from family and uncertain about his values and priorities, Richard Sr. recognized that his son needed more than financial support or career advice. He needed emotional grounding and the kind of unconditional acceptance that money couldn't purchase, but that Grace had provided naturally and consistently. The decision to find Grace took several weeks of internal struggle. Richard Sr. had built his success on making logical business decisions based on quantifiable data, but this situation required him to acknowledge emotional realities that didn't appear on balance sheets. He had to admit that his family's wealth had created certain blind spots, that their privilege had made them careless about relationships and loyalty in ways that were ultimately self-defeating. He had to recognize that Grace's departure had been a mistake, not because Amanda was incompetent, but because he had failed to understand what Grace contributed to his family's well-being. The search proved surprisingly difficult. Grace had left no forwarding address, and the employment agency that had originally placed her had closed several years earlier. Richard Sr. hired a private investigator who specialized in locating former employees, but even professional resources struggled to trace someone who had deliberately chosen to disappear from their former life. Grace had covered her tracks effectively, creating a clean break that protected her from false hope or unwanted contact. Meanwhile, David's struggles at Stanford were intensifying in ways that demanded immediate attention. His grades were suffering, his social relationships were superficial and unsatisfying, and he was questioning fundamental assumptions about success and happiness that had shaped his entire upbringing. During spring break, he spent long hours alone in his room, declining invitations from friends and showing little interest in activities that had once engaged him. When Emma expressed concern about his emotional state, David admitted that he felt lost and unable to connect with anyone who really understood him. The breakthrough came when Sophie mentioned the scrapbook Grace had given her, which she had been reading regularly since the departure. Some of the photographs showed Grace at community events and neighborhood gatherings, providing clues about her interests and possible location. Emma used her research skills to identify the community center where Grace was photographed volunteering, and Richard Sr.'s investigator was finally able to confirm her current address and employment. The decision to approach Grace required careful consideration of timing, method, and message. Richard Sr. knew that any contact would need to acknowledge the pain his family had caused and demonstrate genuine recognition of Grace's value beyond her employment function. He couldn't simply offer her job back as if nothing had changed, because everything had changed. His understanding of her contribution, his awareness of his family's needs, his recognition that loyalty and love deserved different treatment than efficiency and cost reduction. David insisted on making the initial contact himself, recognizing that his own behavior toward Grace required personal accountability and apology. He drove to the community center on a Thursday afternoon in April, nervous and uncertain about what he would say or how she would receive him. The neighborhood was like nothing in his previous experience, bustling with the energy of working families, alive with languages and cultures that his privileged upbringing had never exposed him to directly. He felt both humbled and intrigued by the obvious vitality and community connection that surrounded Grace's new life. Grace was in the main activity room, helping elementary school children with homework, while simultaneously supervising craft projects and mediating playground disputes with the patient expertise he remembered from his own childhood. David watched her for several minutes before she noticed him, struck by how naturally she moved through the organized chaos, how the children responded to her guidance with trust and affection that couldn't be purchased or demanded. She belonged in this environment in ways she had never quite belonged in his family's mansion, despite 13 years of devoted service. When Grace looked up and saw David standing in the doorway, her expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, wariness, curiosity, and something that might have been hope quickly suppressed. She finished helping the child she was working with, spoke quietly to another volunteer about taking over her responsibilities, and approached David with the composed dignity he remembered but had never properly appreciated. "Hello, David," she said simply, her voice carrying no accusation or resentment, just acknowledgement of his presence and uncertain welcome for whatever had brought him to find her. "Grace Miller," David replied, speaking her full name with an emphasis that carried years of delayed recognition and respect. The sound of her complete name, spoken with weight and consideration, seemed to surprise both of them. For the first time in his life, David was seeing Grace as a complete person rather than a function in his household, and the recognition was both humbling and revolutionary. They talked for 2 hours in a quiet corner of the community center, while children played around them and the familiar sounds of family life provided a backdrop to their conversation. David spoke with honesty that surprised him, acknowledging his own blindness and selfishness, recognizing the emotional labor Grace had performed without recognition or appreciation. He told her about Stanford, about feeling disconnected and uncertain, about realizing that his family had lost something essential when they lost her. Grace listened with the same attentive care she had always shown, but David could see that her relationship to him had changed. She was no longer the woman who absorbed his problems and emotions without expecting anything in return. She had built a new life that belonged to her, found work that valued her contributions, created relationships that were reciprocal rather than one-sided. She cared about his struggles, but she was no longer responsible for solving them. Their conversation was interrupted by a small crisis, a kindergarten child who had fallen and scraped his knee, needing the kind of immediate comfort and care that Grace provided instinctively. David watched her kneel beside the crying boy, cleaning his wound while distracting him with gentle humor, holding him until his tears stopped and his confidence returned. The interaction lasted only a few minutes, but it demonstrated everything David had failed to appreciate about Grace's gifts: her ability to heal not just physical injuries, but emotional ones, her instinctive understanding of what people needed to feel safe and loved. When the child returned to playing and Grace turned her attention back to David, something had shifted in their dynamic. David knelt beside her chair, his expensive clothes inappropriate for the concrete floor, but his gesture sincere, in ways that wealth couldn't simulate. "I'm sorry," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of years of casual cruelty and deliberate blindness. "I'm sorry I never saw you. I'm sorry I never thanked you. I'm sorry we let you leave without fighting for you to stay." Grace received his apology with grace, recognizing its sincerity while understanding its limitations. She had spent months processing the pain of her dismissal and had found healing through forgiveness, but forgiveness didn't erase history or restore the years of invisibility she had endured. She appreciated David's recognition of his mistakes, but she was no longer waiting for validation from the family she had served. Her worth was no longer dependent on their acknowledgement, though their acknowledgement was still meaningful. The conversation that followed was difficult and transformative for both of them. Grace spoke honestly about her experience in their household, the ways their wealth had created emotional distance, the loneliness of loving people who were taught not to see her as fully human. David listened with growing shame and understanding, recognizing patterns of privilege and entitlement that he had never questioned. He began to understand that his family's problems extended far beyond Grace's absence. They reflected fundamental assumptions about relationships, loyalty, and the value of different kinds of work. But Grace also spoke about healing and growth, about the satisfaction of her new work and the joy of building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. She had discovered aspects of herself that had been suppressed during her years of service, had found communities that valued her contributions and recognized her wisdom. She wasn't the same woman who had left the mansion 6 months earlier. She was stronger, more confident, more aware of her own worth, and less willing to accept invisibility in exchange for security. As their conversation continued, David began to understand that Grace couldn't simply return to her former role, even if that had been possible or desirable. Too much had changed: her perspective, her self-worth, her understanding of what she deserved from relationships. Any future connection between Grace and his family would need to be built on different foundations, with different expectations and different structures of respect and recognition. The immediate result of their conversation was an invitation for Grace to visit the mansion, not as an employee, but as a guest whose presence was valued and whose contribution was acknowledged. David wanted her to see Emma and Sophie, to allow them the opportunity to express their own recognition and gratitude, to begin healing relationships that had been damaged by carelessness and privilege. Grace accepted the invitation cautiously, understanding that returning to the house would be emotionally complicated, but recognizing the importance of the gesture. The visit was scheduled for the following weekend, when Emma would be home from her college preparatory program and Sophie would be available for an extended conversation. Richard Sr. spent considerable time preparing for the meeting, not just logistically but emotionally, recognizing that he needed to confront his own blindness and selfishness in ways that went far beyond business efficiency. Amanda's presence was deliberately minimized, not because she was incompetent, but because this reunion needed to focus on relationships rather than household management. Grace entered the mansion as a guest rather than an employee, but the familiar sounds and smells triggered complex emotions that she had spent months processing. The house looked exactly the same, but her relationship to it had been transformed by distance and perspective. She could see more clearly now how the wealth had shaped family dynamics, how privilege had created barriers to genuine intimacy, how the emphasis on efficiency and control had impoverished their emotional lives. Emma greeted Grace with tears and apologies, recognizing in ways that surprised her how much Grace's presence had meant to her development and sense of security. At 17, Emma was old enough to understand the social dynamics that had made Grace invisible and mature enough to feel genuine shame about her own participation in those patterns. She had spent months at college thinking about class differences and power structures, and Grace's return forced her to confront how those abstract concepts had played out in her own household. Sophie's reaction was even more emotional, clinging to Grace with desperate intensity while trying to explain everything that had happened in the months since her departure. At 13, Sophie was old enough to recognize that relationships required attention and effort, but still young enough to believe that love could overcome any obstacle. She had kept the scrapbook Grace had given her and had continued adding to it, documenting family events and personal growth that she wanted to share with the woman who had been her most consistent source of emotional support. The family dinner that evening was unlike any meal they had shared before or would share again. For the first time, Grace sat at the table as a guest rather than serving others, engaging in conversation as an equal rather than listening from the periphery. Richard Sr. had prepared remarks acknowledging Grace's contribution to his family and recognizing the mistakes that had led to her departure. His words were careful and sincere, though they couldn't erase years of invisibility or fully compensate for the pain of dismissal. But the most powerful moment came when Sophie asked Grace to help her with a school project about family history. And Grace gently suggested that Sophie might want to include stories about all the people who had contributed to her growth and development, not just her biological relatives. The comment sparked a conversation about different kinds of family relationships, about the ways love could exist across boundaries of class and employment, about recognition and gratitude as active choices rather than automatic responses. David used the opportunity to announce his decision to change his major from business to social work, a choice that represented both personal growth and recognition of values that Grace had modeled throughout his childhood. His father's initial resistance gradually gave way to understanding that David's happiness and fulfillment might require different definitions of success than Richard Sr. had pursued. The conversation that followed revealed how much the family dynamics had shifted, how Grace's departure had forced them to confront emotional needs and relationship patterns they had previously ignored. The evening concluded with Richard Sr. presenting Grace with a formal recognition that transformed their relationship from employer-employee to something more complex and meaningful. He announced the establishment of the Grace Miller Foundation for Children's Emotional Health, funded with a $5 million endowment and dedicated to supporting programs like the community center where Grace now worked. More than just financial compensation, the foundation represented acknowledgement of Grace's values and commitment to continuing her work on a larger scale. Grace received the honor with characteristic humility, though she was clearly moved by the recognition and the opportunity to expand her impact beyond individual relationships. She accepted the invitation to serve on the foundation's board, a role that would allow her to influence programs and policies while maintaining her independence and continuing her direct work with children. The arrangement satisfied everyone's needs: Grace's desire for meaningful work, the family's need for ongoing connection, and the community's need for expanded resources and support. But perhaps more important than the formal arrangements was the shift in understanding that had occurred for everyone involved. David had begun to recognize privilege as responsibility rather than entitlement, understanding that his advantages carried obligations to use them meaningfully. Emma had started questioning assumptions about success and value that she had absorbed without examination, developing more complex perspectives on class, relationships, and social responsibility. Sophie had learned that love required active expression and that gratitude needed to be spoken rather than assumed. Richard Sr. had confronted the limitations of treating family relationships like business arrangements, recognizing that emotional needs couldn't be efficiently managed or cost-effectively outsourced. He had begun to understand that his children's development required more than financial resources and educational opportunities. They needed models of human connection, unconditional support, and genuine care that money couldn't purchase, but that individuals like Grace provided naturally through their commitment and character. The months that followed were a period of gradual rebuilding and growth for everyone involved. Grace continued her work at the community center while also helping to design programs for the new foundation, drawing on her experience to create resources that would support other caregivers and children in need. Her relationship with the Langley children evolved into something more balanced and reciprocal, with regular contact and mutual support that honored both her contribution to their lives and her independence as an individual. David thrived in his new academic program, finding purpose and direction that his business studies had never provided. His relationship with his father remained complicated, but it was no longer defined primarily by disappointment and misunderstanding. Emma discovered passions for social justice and community advocacy that channeled her intelligence and ambition toward meaningful goals. Sophie grew into adolescence with greater emotional security and clearer values, supported by adult relationships that valued her feelings as well as her achievements. Richard Sr. learned to be a more present and emotionally available father, though the process was challenging and ongoing. He began to understand that his greatest legacy might not be the financial empire he had built, but the values and relationships his children would carry forward. He spent more time in direct conversation with his children, less time managing their lives through intermediaries and systems. The house remained wealthy and comfortable, but it also became warmer and more connected to the broader community. The changes weren't without complications and setbacks. Privilege and emotional distance don't disappear overnight, and the family continued to struggle with patterns that had been established over years of wealth and isolation. But Grace's return had provided them with a model of different possibilities, a reminder that love and loyalty deserved recognition and reciprocity, that genuine relationships required vulnerability and mutual respect regardless of economic differences. Grace herself continued to evolve and grow, building on the independence and self-worth she had discovered after leaving the mansion. Her relationship with the Langley family remained important, but no longer defined her identity or constrained her choices. She was able to love them while maintaining boundaries, to support their growth while pursuing her own interests and relationships. The foundation work allowed her to address systemic issues that affected many families like theirs, expanding her impact beyond individual relationships to broader social change. Years later, when David graduated from social work school and Emma completed her studies in international human rights, and when Sophie grew into a confident young woman with clear values and strong relationships, they would all recognize Grace's influence in their development. But by then, the recognition would be mutual. Grace had shaped their capacity for love and empathy, while their acknowledgement and support had helped her heal from her own losses and build a life of meaning and connection. The story became part of family history, passed down as a lesson about recognition, gratitude, and the different forms that love and family can take. Grace's photograph joined the family portraits in the main hallway, her contributions documented and celebrated rather than invisible and taken for granted. But more importantly, the values she had modeled, unconditional care, quiet strength, persistent hope, became part of the family's identity in ways that influenced every subsequent relationship and decision. The Grace Miller Foundation grew into a significant force for children's emotional health and caregiver support, touching thousands of lives across San Francisco and beyond. But its greatest achievement might have been the transformation it represented, the recognition that love and loyalty deserve institutional support, that caring work has value beyond market wages, that families are created through commitment and connection rather than just biology and wealth. 2 years after Grace's return to their lives, the family faced a test of their transformed relationships when Richard Sr. suffered a mild heart attack during a business trip to Singapore. The crisis revealed how deeply their emotional bonds had strengthened and how much they had learned about supporting each other through vulnerability rather than maintaining facades of strength and independence. David, now in his junior year studying social work, immediately flew home from college, recognizing that his father needed more than medical care. He needed the emotional presence of family members who could see him as a human being rather than a financial institution. Emma coordinated with her high school to complete her coursework remotely while staying close to home during the recovery period. Sophie, now 15 and mature beyond her years, took on responsibilities for managing household routines and supporting her siblings through their own anxiety about their father's health. But it was Grace who provided the emotional leadership that held the family together during those difficult weeks. She didn't return to her former role as live-in caregiver, those boundaries remained clearly established, but she visited daily, offering the kind of steady, unconditional support that allowed each family member to process their fears and grief without feeling overwhelmed by responsibility for managing everyone else's emotions. Her presence reminded them that love could be both fierce and gentle, that caring for someone didn't require sacrificing yourself, that strength often looked like knowing when to ask for help. Richard Sr.'s recovery was complicated not just by his physical condition, but by the forced confrontation with his own mortality and the legacy he would leave behind. Lying in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and medical equipment that his wealth couldn't make less frightening, he found himself thinking not about stock portfolios or real estate acquisitions, but about the relationships he had neglected and the love he had failed to recognize or reciprocate. The experience became a catalyst for even deeper changes in how he approached both family and business responsibilities. During those long hospital days, Richard Sr. had conversations with Grace that revealed aspects of her history she had never shared with the family during her years of service. He learned about her childhood in Dublin, growing up in a working-class family where love was abundant, but money was scarce, where community support mattered more than individual achievement. He heard about her late husband's struggle with depression after Lily's death, the way grief had poisoned their marriage and left them both isolated in their pain. He began to understand that Grace's capacity for nurturing had been forged in loss and sustained by a conscious choice to believe in healing, despite evidence of how badly love could hurt. These conversations changed Richard Sr.'s perspective on wealth and responsibility in profound ways. And he started to understand that his financial success had meaning only insofar as it could be used to create opportunities for connection and care, that privilege without empathy was ultimately empty and destructive. He began making changes in his business practices, seeking investments that aligned with social values rather than simply maximizing returns, treating employees as whole human beings rather than interchangeable resources. The transformation was most evident in how he approached the family foundation, which had grown from Grace's initial endowment into a multifaceted organization addressing children's emotional health, caregiver support, and family stability across the Bay Area. Richard Sr. became actively involved in foundation work, not just as a financial contributor, but as someone who visited programs, listened to children and families sharing their stories, and used his business connections to expand resources and opportunities. One particularly meaningful project emerged from Grace's suggestion that the foundation address the needs of child care workers and domestic staff, people like her former self who provided essential emotional labor while remaining largely invisible and undervalued. The Grace Miller Institute for Caregiver Excellence became a training and support center that offered professional development, emotional resources, and advocacy for domestic workers throughout the region. The Institute's programs included courses in child development and trauma-informed care, but also workshops on workers' rights, professional boundaries, and self-advocacy skills that Grace had learned too late in her own career. The center provided a community for domestic workers who had often been isolated in their jobs, creating networks of support and mutual recognition that challenged the invisibility that had characterized Grace's experience in wealthy households. David spent his summers during college working with the Institute, learning about labor rights and economic justice, while also processing his own family's complicity in systems that exploited caring relationships. His education in social work was enriched by direct experience with the communities he hoped to serve, and his privileged background became a tool for understanding and challenging inequality rather than simply perpetuating it. Emma, now preparing for college with plans to study international human rights, connected foundation work with her growing awareness of global economic systems and patterns of exploitation. She spent her senior year researching domestic work and care labor in different cultural contexts, producing a thesis project that examined how wealth and class dynamics shaped family relationships across different societies. Her work would later inform foundation programs designed to address the immigrant experience and culturally responsive approaches to family support. Sophie, entering high school with a clear sense of her own values and social awareness unusual for her age, became the family's conscious reminder of their commitment to seeing and acknowledging the people who supported their lifestyle. She insisted that household staff be included in family celebrations, that their contributions be acknowledged publicly, that their professional development and personal goals be supported through foundation resources. Her natural leadership skills were channeled toward justice and advocacy rather than simply social dominance. Grace watched these transformations with quiet pride, recognizing that the children she had loved in silence were becoming adults who understood love as action rather than sentiment. But she also continued her own growth and development, pursuing educational opportunities that had been delayed by her years of service and economic necessity. At 55, she enrolled in graduate school, studying child psychology and family systems, with the goal of developing more sophisticated theoretical frameworks for the practical wisdom she had accumulated through experience. Her master's thesis examined the emotional labor performed by domestic workers and its impact on both caregivers and the families they serve. The research drew on her own experience and interviews with hundreds of other domestic workers, creating an academic foundation for policy discussions about fair wages, labor protections, and recognition of care work as skilled professional practice. The work was later published as research that influenced legislation and labor organizing throughout California. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in Grace's relationship with her own history of loss and grief. Working with the foundation had connected her with many families dealing with childhood illness, loss, and trauma. Through supporting others, she found ways to honor Lily's memory that felt healing rather than painful. She established memorial programs that provided support for families dealing with pediatric cancer, creating communities of care that might have made her own experience less isolating. The anniversary of Lily's death, which had been a day of private mourning for more than 15 years, became instead a day of celebration, of the love they had shared, of the strength Grace had found, of the children whose lives had been touched by the wisdom born from that loss. The Langley children learned about Lily not as a source of sadness, but as the inspiration for Grace's capacity to love other people's children so completely. 5 years after Grace's departure and return, the family gathered for David's graduation from social work school. The celebration was held at the mansion, but it looked nothing like the formal events of earlier years. The house was filled with people from all parts of their extended community: children from the community center, colleagues from the foundation, domestic workers from the institute, neighbors who had become friends rather than just residents of the same exclusive neighborhood. Grace stood at the center of this celebration, no longer invisible or peripheral, but recognized as the architect of much of the love and connection that surrounded them. David's graduation speech thanked many people for their support and guidance, but his acknowledgement of Grace was both public and personal, recognizing her not just as a former employee who had cared for him, but as a woman whose wisdom and strength had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a person of value. "Grace Miller," he said, speaking her full name with the same weight and respect he had used in the community center years earlier, "taught me that love is not a sentiment but a practice, not a feeling but a choice, renewed daily through small acts of attention and care. She showed me that privilege is meaningless unless it serves something larger than itself, that wealth without empathy is poverty of the worst kind. Everything I hope to accomplish in my career and my life builds on the foundation she provided during years when I was too young and too selfish to recognize what she was giving me." The speech was met with applause, but also with something deeper, The recognition that transformation is possible, that relationships can be healed, that patterns of blindness and exploitation can be confronted and changed. Grace wiped away tears. But they were tears of joy rather than the pain that had once defined her relationship to invisibility and dismissal. Emma spoke next, sharing her plans to spend the following year working with an international human rights organization focused on domestic workers' rights around the world. Her year abroad would be funded by the foundation, but guided by principles she had learned from watching Grace's transformation from invisible servant to recognized leader. She would carry with her not just academic knowledge, but a deep understanding of how dignity and recognition could heal relationships damaged by inequality and indifference. Sophie, now 17 and preparing for her own college applications, announced her intention to study early childhood education and family counseling. Inspired by Grace's example and committed to working with children and families in ways that honored their full humanity. She had been accepted to several prestigious universities, but had chosen to attend a state school with strong community connections and programs that served diverse populations, a choice that reflected values that money alone couldn't teach. Richard Sr.'s remarks were brief but profound, acknowledging that his children had become people he was proud to know, and that they had done so largely through the influence of a woman he had once treated as hired help. He spoke about learning to see wealth as responsibility, success as service, and family as something created through commitment and care rather than inherited through accident of birth. But the evening's most powerful moment came when Grace was asked to speak about her own plans and dreams. Standing before this gathering of people who represented every part of her life, past and present, professional and personal, sorrowful and celebratory, she spoke about the journey from invisibility to recognition, from serving others to honoring herself, from loving in silence to expecting love in return. I spent many years believing that my value came from what I could give others without asking for anything back, she said, her voice clear and strong in a way it had never been during her years of service. I learned to make myself small so that others could feel larger. I learned to be quiet so that others could speak. I learned to disappear so that others could take up all the space they wanted. She paused, looking around the room at faces both familiar and new, at children who had grown into adults and adults who had learned to grow. But what I've discovered is that love doesn't require invisibility. Care doesn't demand silence. Service doesn't mean erasing yourself. True relationship, whether in families, in employment, in communities, requires all parties to be fully present, fully human, fully deserving of recognition and respect. Grace's words hung in the air like a benediction, blessing not just their individual transformations, but the possibility of different ways of being together in a world where inequality and exploitation were often taken for granted. The applause that followed was not just appreciation for her speech, but recognition of the courage it takes to move from silence to voice, from the margins to the center, from serving others to honoring the full complexity of one's own humanity. The celebration continued late into the evening, with conversations that crossed every boundary of age, class, and background that had once defined the rigid hierarchies of the Langley household. Grace moved through the gathering not as a hostess or a guest, but as someone who belonged completely, whose presence enriched every interaction, and whose wisdom was sought by people who once would never have thought to ask her opinion about anything that mattered. Later, after the last guest had departed and the family had said their good nights, Grace stood alone in the kitchen where she had spent so many years, loving in silence. The space looked different now, not because it had been remodeled, but because her relationship to it had been transformed. This was no longer the place where she had made herself invisible while nurturing others. It had become instead a symbol of transformation possible, of relationships that could be healed, of love that could be recognized and reciprocated, even after years of being taken for granted. David found her there, drawn by the same instincts that had once brought him to this kitchen during moments of confusion and vulnerability. But now he approached her as an equal, someone seeking conversation rather than comfort, offering presence rather than just receiving it. They talked about his plans for his first job working with homeless families, about the challenges of translating privilege into service, about the ongoing work of building relationships based on justice rather than charity. "You know," David said as their conversation was winding down, "I used to think that what you gave us was natural, just part of who you are. I never understood that love like yours was a choice you made every day, often despite how we treated you. I never understood that kindness could be an act of courage, that caring for people who don't see you requires a strength I'm not sure I have." Grace smiled, recognizing in his words the wisdom that came from finally understanding the difference between taking love for granted and recognizing it as gift. "You have that strength," she said quietly. "You've had it all along. You just needed to learn to see it in yourself the same way you learned to see it in others." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma and Sophie, who had been walking in the garden and had seen the light in the kitchen. The four of them sat around the island where Grace had prepared thousands of meals, where she had comforted scraped knees and broken hearts, where she had loved in silence while hoping that love would somehow be enough. Now they sat as family, not the family defined by biology or wealth, but the family created through recognition, respect, and the conscious choice to see and honor each other's full humanity. They talked about everything and nothing, about college plans and career dreams, about books they were reading and places they hoped to travel, about the foundation's work and the lives it was touching, about the ongoing challenge of living ethically in a world that made ethical living difficult. The conversation flowed with easy intimacy that would have been impossible during the years when Grace's presence was tolerated, but her personhood was invisible. As dawn began to lighten the windows, painting the kitchen in soft pastels that reminded Grace of Dublin mornings from her childhood, she looked around at these young people who had become her family in ways that transcended employment or obligation. They had learned to love and be loved, to see and be seen, to recognize and be recognized. They were ready to carry forward into their own lives the lessons that her presence had taught them, the values that her sacrifice had modeled, the possibilities that her transformation had revealed. The Grace Miller Foundation continued to grow and evolve, touching thousands of lives across the Bay Area and inspiring similar programs in cities across the country. But its greatest achievement remained the transformation of the relationships that had created it, the movement from blindness to sight, from exploitation to justice, from love given in silence to love recognized and reciprocated. Grace herself, now approaching her 60th birthday, had become a nationally recognized expert on care work and family systems, someone whose insights were sought by policymakers and researchers working to address inequality and improve support for children and families. But she never forgot the years of invisibility that had taught her to value recognition, the silence that had made her voice so powerful when she finally chose to use it. And the mansion still stands above Pacific Heights, its windows still catching the morning fog as it rolls in from the bay. But the family that lives there now understands something about wealth that money can't teach, that true prosperity includes recognizing and nurturing the relationships that hold us together, that privilege carries obligations to see and support those who see and support us, that love given freely deserves gratitude expressed openly. Grace Miller's legacy lives in every conversation where appreciation is spoken rather than assumed, every relationship where care is acknowledged rather than invisible, every family that chooses connection over convenience. The story spreads quietly, the way important truths often do. Not through dramatic announcements, but through changed lives that touch other lives, through relationships that model different possibilities, through the slow, steady work of building a world where love is recognized and caring work is valued. Children who grew up in the Foundation's programs carry forward its lessons about dignity and recognition. Domestic workers who found community and support through the Institute teach others about rights and self-advocacy. Families who learn to see and honor their caregivers create ripples of change that extend far beyond any individual household. And Grace continues the work she has always done, nurturing children, supporting families, building connections that transcend boundaries of class and circumstance. But she does it as a recognized expert and valued community leader rather than an invisible servant, her wisdom sought and celebrated rather than taken for granted. She has found her voice and claimed her space, while never losing the gentle strength that sustained her through years of invisibility and dismissal. On quiet evenings, when the Foundation offices are closed and the programs have ended for the day, Grace sometimes returns to the community center in the Sunset District where David first found her. She watches new groups of children playing and learning, sees new families building connections and finding support, observes the endless cycle of caring that sustains communities and creates hope for the future. The children there don't know her history, don't understand the journey that brought her from invisibility to recognition, from serving in silence to speaking with authority. To them, she is simply Miss Grace, the woman who remembers their names and celebrates their achievements, who listens to their problems and helps them find solutions, who sees their potential and nurtures their growth with the same patient attention she once gave to children who had too much money and not enough love. But sometimes, watching these children discover their own strength and voice, Grace thinks about the long path that brought her here, about the daughter she lost and the children she gained, about the years of loving without recognition and the recognition that finally came, about the family she served and the family she created, about the silence she kept and the voice she found. And she knows that every tear she cried in secret, every moment of loneliness she endured, every act of love she gave without acknowledgement contributed to the strength and wisdom that now serves not just one family, but countless families. Not just 3 privileged children, but hundreds of children from every background and circumstance. Her pain had purpose, her sacrifice had meaning, her love had power that extended far beyond the marble walls where it had once been invisible. The children call to her now, asking for help with homework or mediation of playground disputes, and Grace rises to meet their needs with the same grace she has always embodied. But now she does so as someone whose contributions are recognized, whose wisdom is valued, whose love is reciprocated and celebrated. She is moved from the shadows to the light, while never forgetting that shadows exist and that people love there too, waiting for someone to see them, to value them, to call them by name with the respect and recognition that every human being deserves. And you, have you ever cared for someone who later forgot you? Have you felt that ache of invisibility, the sting of unspoken gratitude, the weight of loving without being seen? Your story matters too. Tell me in the comments about the Grace Millers in your life, the people who held your world together while standing in the shadows. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who deserves to feel valued and seen. For more stories that remind us what truly binds families together, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this path of recognition and healing with us. We'll meet again in the next story where love always finds its way to the light.